The morning room at Barrett Hall smelled of cold ash and fresh ink, and Henry had been sitting at the writing desk since 7:30, answering her mother's correspondence. There were 6 letters that required replies. Henry wrote them all in her own hand, as she had done every morning for the better part of 2 years, since the household secretary had been dismissed to reduce expenses. The letters concerned an invitation to a musical evening in Dorchester, a dressmaker's bill that needed disputing, and a note from the Barrett family solicitor, a Mr. Crewe, requesting confirmation of a date. Henry copied her mother's signature at the bottom of each one, pressed the sealing wax without comment, and stacked them neatly beside the inkwell. She was reaching for the 6th when she heard her mother's voice through the door of the adjoining sitting room, and she paused with the quill still in her hand. "Tell Mr. Crewe to send it by Thursday," Lady Cecilia was saying. "Sir Edmund is coming from Dorchester on Friday, and I will want everything in order before he arrives." The voice on the other side of the conversation was lower, and Henry could not make out the reply. She set the quill down. She straightened the stack of sealed letters with 2 fingers and said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say. She had heard her mother speak Sir Edmund Foss's name with increasing frequency over the preceding 3 weeks, always in connection with the solicitor's office, always with that particular tone of settled satisfaction that Lady Cecilia reserved for arrangements she considered already concluded. Henry had not been consulted. She had not been asked. She had folded this knowledge into her daily routine as she folded everything else, without protest and without collapse. And she had continued to answer the correspondence and light the morning room fire and arrange the flowers in the blue vase on the hall table every second day when the last ones had begun to droop. She was 22 years old. She was the only daughter of the late Mr. Gerald Barrett, who had died 3 years earlier, leaving a gambling debt of £3,000 and a house that was maintained, barely, on the income from 2 small tenant farms. She had her father's grey eyes and his tendency towards silence in rooms where silence made other people uncomfortable. She had her mother's surname and nothing much else. The house sat on the edge of the Ashvale estate, 1/2 mile from the boundary marker where the Barrett land ended and the Ashvale parkland began. It was a respectable distance from respectability, her mother liked to say, meaning it as a complaint. Henry had never heard it as anything other than a description of the family's particular geography in the social landscape of this part of Dorset. Near enough to observe the quality of things available to people of greater standing, far enough removed to understand that such things would require effort to obtain. She finished the last letter, pressed the seal, and placed it with the others. She did not know yet that her name was already on a contract she had never seen. The following Tuesday was the first morning cold enough to require a coat, the autumn having shifted overnight from mild to purposeful, and Henry was walking the boundary path with a small basket over one arm when she saw the man on the far side of the old stone marker. He was standing in the long grass at the edge of the Ashvale meadow with a surveyor's rod set upright beside him and a notebook open in one hand, writing something down in small, precise characters. He was dressed plainly, a dark coat that had seen some weather, boots that were better quality than the coat implied. He did not look up immediately when she paused. She waited a moment. He was marking a measurement, and she had learned from her father that a man engaged in precise work preferred not to be interrupted at the calculation. When he finally raised his head, she noted that he was younger than she had expected, perhaps 8 or 10 years older than herself, with a careful, self-possessed face, and the sort of stillness in the shoulders that suggested he was accustomed to remaining in one position for extended periods without restlessness. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning, miss." His voice was unhurried. She asked whether he had come far, and he said he had ridden from the village that morning, which was 4 miles. She looked at the coat and the open notebook and the cold that was, she thought, sharper than it appeared from inside the house. "Have you had anything to drink this morning?" she asked. He glanced at the basket and then back at her with a very slight attention in his expression, as though he were recalibrating something. "I have not," he said. She had a small flask of cider vinegar in the basket, which Mrs. Potts had packed for the walk to the Tennant Farms, and a cloth napkin containing 3 biscuits meant for old Thomas, the groom. She gave the man the flask and watched him drink from it with the brief, contained gratitude of someone who was thirsty and had not said so. He returned it and thanked her in a phrase short enough to be genuine. "How long will the survey take?" she asked. 4 weeks in all. I am measuring the eastern and southern boundaries of the Ashvale estate." He paused. "There is some question about where the Ashvale land ends and the Barrett land begins along the southern marker." Henry said this had been a question since her grandfather's time, and that the documents in the Barrett household library were imprecise on the matter, though her father had maintained the boundary had never been formally disputed. He listened to this with attention, wrote something in the notebook, and closed it. She walked on to the Tennant Farms, delivered the biscuits to Thomas, discussed the condition of the Northfield hedge with Mr. Crane, the older of the 2 tenants, and returned by the boundary path an hour later. The man with the surveyor's rod had moved some distance south along the meadow edge. He was still writing. His name, she learned that evening from Mrs. Potts, was Mr. Whitmore. He had arranged to stable his horse at the village inn for the duration of the survey and came out each morning at 8:30. Mrs. Potts relayed this with the mild interest she brought to all useful intelligence, setting a cup of tea on the writing desk beside Henry without being asked. "He came to the kitchen door this afternoon to return the flask," Mrs. Potts said. "He asked if it belonged to the household and wanted to return it to whoever had carried it this morning. I told him Miss Barrett walked the boundary path Tuesdays and Thursdays, and he thanked me and said he hoped he had not inconvenienced her." She arranged the tea things. "He has very good manners for a land surveyor." Henry said that land surveyors were not generally known for poor manners, and Mrs. Potts made a small sound that encompassed, in her particular way, an entire range of observations she was choosing not to verbalize. Sir Edmund Foss arrived from Dorchester on the Friday as intended, and Henry met him for the first time in the Barrett drawing-room at 4 o'clock, with the afternoon light, coming grey and flat through the west-facing windows. He was a man of perhaps 50, broad across the chest, with the careful dress of someone who spent more on his tailor than his character warranted. He greeted Lady Cecilia with the ease of prior acquaintance, and Henry with the brief, assessing courtesy of someone confirming the condition of an item he was considering purchasing. He asked whether she played, meaning the pianoforte, and whether she was in good health, and whether she had any knowledge of household management. Henry answered each question with level precision, and watched him nod after each answer in a way that made the nods feel like entries in a ledger. He stayed 2 hours and departed without any formal announcement being made. Lady Cecilia saw him to the carriage herself. When she returned to the drawing-room, she sat in the chair nearest the fire and looked at Henry with that same settled satisfaction Henry had heard through the morning-room door a week earlier. "Sir Edmund finds you suitable," she said. Henry set down her embroidery, which she had not been making any progress on. "Suitable for what purpose, mother?" "For the purpose of becoming his wife." Lady Cecilia smoothed the arm of the chair. "He is a widower. He has a house in Dorchester and an income that will cover the Barrett debt comfortably. The arrangement is very sensible." Henry said that she understood the debt, which she did, and that she understood the sensibleness of the arrangement, which she also did, but that she had not been asked whether she wished to enter into it. Lady Cecilia looked at her with the expression she reserved for statements she considered beside the point. The solicitor will send the papers for Thursday next. Mr. Crewe will require a signature. She stood. You will review them before Sir Edmund calls on Friday. She left the room. The fire had burned low, and the light through the windows was nearly gone, and Henry sat in the grey drawing room for some time without moving, her hands on her lap, looking at the cold grate. She had not yet refused anything. She was considering what refusal would cost, and the cost was, she understood, very specific. The Barrett tenancy, the household, her mother's social standing in this part of Dorset, and the debt of £3,000, which had been her father's but had settled onto the family like weather that could not be walked out of. She had not yet refused. She had simply stopped pretending there was no question to answer. The week had a particular quality after that. Henry walked the Boundary Path on Tuesday with the cider vinegar flask again, though she told herself it was the same route she always walked. And it was. She found Mr. Whitmore in much the same position as the week before. A little farther south, the survey rod planted in the earth and the notebook open. He acknowledged her with a brief nod, and she asked after his progress, and he said he had measured 11 of the 24 boundary markers and expected the eastern line to be completed by the end of the second week. He spoke about the survey with a comfortable precision that suggested he found the work genuinely absorbing, and Henry found herself interested in spite of herself, or perhaps because of herself. She asked what the question was, exactly, about the southern boundary. He turned the notebook to show her a small pencil sketch of the field lines, with the old stone marker at the centre, and dotted lines indicating two different historical interpretations of the boundary. He explained the discrepancy in 3 sentences that were models of compressed clarity. She looked at the sketch for a moment, and then at the land itself, and then she said that she believed the second interpretation was likelier, because the drainage ditch running along the lower edge of the Barrett field predated the first survey by at least 30 years, and that the ditch had always been understood by her family to mark the practical boundary even where the documents were imprecise. He looked at her. He wrote something in the notebook and then looked at her again with a quality of attention she was not accustomed to receiving in this particular stretch of her domestic life. "That is a very useful observation," he said. She gave him the flask, and this time he did not attempt to return it the same day. He brought it back on Thursday morning, walking up from the Boundary Path to the kitchen door with it in one hand, which Mrs. Potts reported with additional detail Henry had not requested, but found herself glad to have. The library at Barrett Hall was small and imperfectly organised, a condition it had been in since Henry's father had last arranged it, to his own satisfaction some years before his death, meaning it was organised according to his interests and habits rather than any formal system. There were good books in it nonetheless, and Henry had her own relationship with most of them, including a copy of White's Natural History of Selborne that she had read several times, and a volume of Roman road maps of Britain that she had found useful once, when attempting to understand why the lane at the edge of the property ran at so improbable an angle. She was reading the White on a Wednesday afternoon when she heard a knock at the outer door and Mrs. Potts's voice, and then another voice she recognised, and then Mrs. Potts saying with careful neutrality that she would inquire. Mr. Whitmore had, it emerged, found a reference in a volume he was using to prepare the survey, a map dated 1731, which named the drainage ditch as the Barrett Drain, in a way that appeared to confirm her Thursday observation directly. He wished to know whether the household had any documents dated before 1760 relating to the field boundaries. Henry was in the library when Mrs. Potts delivered this information, and she said that he was welcome to come in and look, because the library was exactly where such documents would be if they existed at all. He came in. He examined the section of shelving where the household papers were kept in 3 leather-bound folders that had not been fully sorted since her father's time, and Henry sat at the reading table with the white open in front of her and read a paragraph about the migrations of swallows. He was quiet while he worked, as she had expected, and did not offer commentary. After perhaps 20 minutes, he found a document dated 1748 that referred to the ditch by name and confirmed the drainage course's alignment with the pre-survey boundary. He held it toward the window to read it, and then set it carefully on the writing desk with both hands. "May I make a copy of this?" he asked. "Of course," she said. He copied it in the same small, precise characters she had noticed in the field notebook, working at the desk without asking for light, though the afternoon was failing, and it had grown dim. She found herself looking up from the white twice, and the second time she looked up, he was watching the window rather than the page, with a stillness that read as thought rather than inattention, and she returned to the swallows without comment. He thanked her when he left. He said the document would clarify the question of the boundary materially. She said she was glad it was useful, and he paused in the library doorway for a moment, before inclining his head and going. The papers from Mr. Crewe arrived the following Thursday as promised. Henry sat with them at the writing desk for over an hour. They were 3 pages, closely written in the solicitor's careful hand, describing the terms of a marriage settlement between Miss Henrietta Jane Barrett, spinster, of Barrett Hall, Dorset, and Sir Edmund Foss, Baronet, of Dorchester. The debt of £3,000 being the outstanding balance of the late Mr. Gerald Barrett's obligations, would be retired upon the solemnization of the marriage. The bride was described throughout the document as a willing party, the settlement having been agreed to by her and entered into voluntarily. She read the signature page twice. At the bottom, in ink that was slightly darker than the text of the document, was a signature. It was her name. It was written in a hand that was very close to her own, but not exact, and she knew with the particular certainty of someone who had spent 2 years copying another person's correspondence that she had not written it. She sat very still for a long time. The fire in the morning room had burned past its warmest point and was declining toward a bed of low coals. Outside the window, the elm tree had lost most of its leaves in the past week, and the sky beyond it was the flat, even grey of a November afternoon without any particular feature. She folded the papers carefully along their existing creases, placed them back in the solicitor's envelope, and put the envelope in the drawer of the writing desk. Then she went to find Mrs. Potts. Mrs. Potts was in the kitchen, doing something with dried lavender and a length of muslin. She looked up when Henry came in and read her face with the efficiency of long practice. "Sit down," she said, and set the lavender aside. Henry sat at the kitchen table. She said, in the level voice she used when she needed to be precise, that there was a signature on the settlement papers that she had not made. Mrs. Potts received this information without visible surprise, which told Henry something she had half suspected. "Did you know?" Henry asked. "I knew your mother sent a letter to Mr. Crewe 3 weeks ago that she did not want written by you," Mrs. Potts said. "I did not know what was in it." She folded her hands on the table. "What will you do?" Henry said she did not know yet. She sat in the kitchen for a while, and Mrs. Potts made tea and did not offer opinions, which was one of the qualities Henry had relied on most consistently across the past 3 years. She still did not know what she would do. She knew what had been done to her, which was a different kind of knowledge, and it required sitting with longer before it became a direction. 2 days later, she overheard the rest of it. She had come downstairs early, before the household was fully roused, to retrieve a book she had left in the drawing room the previous evening. The drawing room door was ajar. Her mother was inside, and the voice with her, speaking in the low, businesslike tone of a man confirming the terms of a transaction, was Sir Edmund's. He had arrived the evening before for Friday's call and had, apparently, stayed the night, which Henry had not been told. She stopped in the corridor with the cold floor through her slippers and the early light coming thin through the hall window. "She has not seen the document?" Sir Edmund was asking. "She has seen it," Lady Cecilia said. "She knows what is in it. The signature has already been provided, so there is nothing for her to review." A pause. "You are confident the signature will hold before Crewe?" "Crewe does not examine signatures against exemplars. He is not a magistrate. He receives the document, he witnesses the names, and he proceeds." Her mother's voice was smooth and efficient. "Henrietta would never have signed it willingly. She has her father's stubbornness and none of his good sense about money. The name is on the paper, and the paper is in order." Henry stood in the corridor. The floor was very cold, and the light through the hall window was very pale, and she was aware of the sound of her own breathing. She stood there until she had heard enough, which was not long, and then she went back upstairs without the book. She had known since Thursday that the signature was not hers. She had not known until this morning that her mother understood precisely what she had done, and had done it without hesitation. The difference between the two forms of knowledge was measurable. It had a specific weight. She dressed, she went down to breakfast, she ate without speaking, and Lady Cecilia spoke enough for both of them about Sir Edmund's expectations for the household at Dorchester and the necessity of Henry making a favourable impression at the forthcoming meeting with the Dorchester Foss connections. Henry ate her toast and looked at the window. She walked the Boundary Path that afternoon. Mr. Whitmore was in the south meadow, packing his instruments into a worn leather case, his survey of the eastern line apparently complete for the day. She walked out to where he was standing and said, "Good afternoon." And he said good afternoon. And for a moment, they stood on either side of the old stone marker in the grey November air, without speaking. She was aware that she looked different than she had on previous days, that the change in her bearing was visible because she had observed it herself in the glass that morning, and recognized the particular expression she wore when she was maintaining composure against a specific weight. He looked at her for a moment with the quality of attention that was, she had come to understand, characteristic. He did not ask questions. "The south boundary is resolved," he said eventually. "Good," she said. The document from 1748 was sufficient. She said she was glad, and she meant it, and they stood in the field for a while longer, while a pair of rooks circled the elm tree on the Barrett side of the boundary, and the cold came in steadily from the east. "Are you well, Miss Barrett?" he asked. It was such a plain question, asked with such careful restraint, that she found it briefly more difficult to answer than any question that contained complexity. She said she was quite well, which was nearly true in the specific sense he was asking, and he accepted this with a nod that did not quite close the subject. The following week was the last of the 4 weeks he had been assigned to the survey. She knew this and felt it as a kind of compression in the days, which she noted without acting on, as she was in the habit of noting things she could not alter. They met in the library once more on the Wednesday, when he came to return the 1748 document he had copied and to leave a formal record of the Boundary Survey's findings with the household, as was customary practice. He placed the document on the library desk and remained standing while she read the summary page. The drainage ditch had been confirmed as the historical southern boundary of the Ashvale estate. The Barrett land south of the ditch was unambiguously Barrett land. He had resolved what had not been resolved since her grandfather's time. "This will matter," she said, "when the estate changes hands." He looked at her steadily. "The estate does not change hands in the foreseeable future," he said. She did not ask what he meant. There was a precision in the sentence that had the quality of information rather than comfort, and she filed it as she filed other small, legible truths she had accumulated in his company. He stood near the window with the notebook closed under one arm, and the late November light was flat and clear through the old glass, and Henry was aware with a very specific and inconvenient clarity that she did not want him to leave the library. She looked at the survey document rather than at him. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "whatever your business at Ashvale is, I hope it goes well." A very brief pause. "Thank you," he said. "I hope matters are resolved satisfactorily for you also, Miss Barrett." He said it quietly, looking at her, and it was not a general wish of the kind exchanged between near strangers. She understood that. She did not know what to do with understanding it under current circumstances. And she said good afternoon, and he said good afternoon, and he took his coat from the chair and went. That evening, by the fire in the small upstairs sitting room she used in winter because it held warmth better than the drawing room, she wrote 2 letters. The first was to Mr. Crewe, the solicitor, requesting a meeting before Friday's confirmation on a matter concerning the settlement document she wished to discuss in person. The second was a short note to Mrs. Potts placed under the library door which said only, "I have decided. Do not worry." Mrs. Potts found it the following morning and said nothing at breakfast, except to put an extra portion of marmalade beside Henry's plate and pat her once, briefly, on the shoulder. The meeting with Mr. Crewe was on Thursday at 11 o'clock. Henry drove herself in the light gig which she was capable of managing and which prevented her mother from accompanying her. She arrived at Crewe's office in the village above the lending library and was admitted without waiting, because she had written that the matter was urgent. Mr. Crewe was a small, careful man who had handled Barrett family business since before Henry was born and who treated her, as he treated all women in his professional life, with the kind of deliberate courtesy that assumed she would eventually require explanation of any term longer than 2 syllables. She disabused him of this efficiently. She placed her own signature on the desk beside him, written fresh on a sheet of paper she had brought for the purpose, and asked him to compare it with the signature on the settlement document, which she asked him to retrieve from the file. He looked at both. He set them side by side. He looked at them for a longer time than seemed comfortable. "Miss Barrett," he said. "I did not sign the document," she said. "The signature is not mine. I am prepared to state so in any proceeding that requires it, and I am prepared to provide as many comparative exemplars as you or anyone else might need. I will not authenticate the settlement before you today, and I will not authenticate it at any future date." Mr. Crewe looked at the 2 signatures for a moment longer. Then he placed the settlement document face down on the desk and folded his hands on top of it. "I see," he said, and then, "This will require some consideration." "Yes," Henry said, "it will." She stood. "I trust you will inform Sir Edmund that the matter is not concluded as he may have assumed." She drove herself home. The morning was cold and the road was empty, and the bare hedgerows on either side ran past in parallel lines. She had refused. The cost of refusal was still unknown in its particulars, but the refusal itself was done, and she felt the specific and uncomplicated solidity of having acted according to what she actually was, rather than what the contract had decided she was. Sir Edmund arrived at Barrett Hall on Friday at 2 o'clock. He was not calm. He had received a message from Crewe that morning, evidently, and his expression as he came through the door was the expression of a man accustomed to contracts settling themselves, who had discovered, with displeasure, that this one had declined to do so. Lady Cecilia was waiting in the drawing-room with a tight, braced composure. Henry was there also, standing near the fireplace, because she had decided to be present rather than sent for. They were conducting this particular scene, the 3 of them, when the sound of wheels on the gravel drive reached the drawing-room, and Lady Cecilia glanced at the window with a frown that indicated she had not invited anyone else for the afternoon. The caller was Lord Halsworth, from the neighbouring estate of Crestfield. He was a man in his 60s who had known the Barrett family since the late Mr. Barrett's day, and who arrived with the easy, unremarked confidence of someone who felt entitled to call on a Friday afternoon without extensive notice. He was shown into the drawing room by the housemaid who had answered the door before Mrs. Potts could intercept, and he came in already speaking, the way men of his generation and standing often did, in the middle of a sentence whose beginning he considered understood. He stopped when he saw the room was occupied more fully than he had expected. "Lady Cecilia," he said with the brief courtesy. Then his gaze found the other standing figure in the room, the one near the window who was not Sir Edmund and not Henry, and his expression shifted from social ease into something more alert. Henry did not immediately understand the shift. She followed Lord Halsworth's gaze to Mr. Whitmore, who had come in a little behind Lord Halsworth, and who was standing very still near the door with the surveyor's notebook in his coat pocket and an expression she could not immediately read. Lord Halsworth said, with the mild puzzlement of a man who has found something in an unexpected location, "My Lord Ashvale, I had no idea you were in the neighbourhood." The drawing-room was silent. Henry looked at Mr. Whitmore. He was looking at her, not at Lord Halsworth, not at Sir Edmund, whose face had developed a particular quality of arrested calculation, not at Lady Cecilia, who had stood up from her chair and was very still in the way of someone who has received information that is reconfiguring something fundamental. He was looking at Henry. Lord Halsworth perceived that something was occurring that he had walked into the middle of, and said, with the veteran social instinct of a man who had sat in a great many charged drawing-rooms, that he had only called to return a book he had borrowed from the Barrett Library last spring, and that perhaps he had come at an inconvenient moment. No one addressed this. After a moment, James said, still looking at Henry, "I had intended to explain this myself. I am sorry the occasion arrived in this manner." Henry said nothing. She was assembling the understanding, which came in pieces in quick succession. The 4 weeks of survey work on the Ashvale estate, the precision of the notebook, the coat that had been better than it appeared, the sentence in the library about the estate not changing hands in the foreseeable future, the way he had listened about the drainage ditch with the attention of a man whose interest was more than professional. The bearing she had registered as oddly out of place in a land surveyor and had filed without naming. Mrs. Potts appeared in the drawing-room doorway, drawn there by the silence in the way she was always drawn by the significant silences of the Barrett household. She looked at the room and then at Henry. "Mr. Whitmore," Henry said, and then stopped, because the name was no longer the correct name and she had not yet assembled the correct one. "James Whitmore is my mother's family name," he said quietly. "The title is Ashvale. James Whitmore, 6th Earl of Ashvale." He said it in the same compressed, unhurried sentences he had used for everything else, and with the same absence of performance that she now understood was lifelong. Sir Edmund found his voice before Lady Cecilia did. He said, with the remnants of his earlier displeasure still audible under a newly applied caution, that he was not aware Lord Ashvale had taken a personal interest in the Barrett estate's affairs. James looked at him for the first time since the drawing-room had gone still. "The Ashvale debt ledger records a note for £3,000 held by your firm against the Barrett estate," he said. "The note has been retired as of Thursday last. The Barrett family carries no outstanding obligation to you." Sir Edmund opened his mouth and then closed it. The calculation in his face cycled through several stages and arrived at a position that had very little to work with. He had arrived today as a creditor with a contract, and the contract had been voided by the solicitor's own records, and the debt that had made the contract possible had now been extinguished by the man standing near the Barrett drawing-room window with a surveyor's notebook in his pocket. There was no position available to him in the room that was not a diminished one. Lady Cecilia sat down. She looked, in this moment, not particularly cruel, because cruelty had been the expression of a position she had held, and the position was no longer available to her, either. She looked like a woman who had spent a considerable period of effort and calculation on a plan, and had discovered that the plan's foundation was not where she had understood it to be. The tight, braced composure of 10 minutes ago had relaxed into something that was simply tired. Henry looked at her mother. She did not say anything, because there was nothing she needed to say. The room had said it. Lord Halsworth, who had remained near the door through all of this with the practiced composure of a man who has witnessed a great many drawing-rooms rearrange themselves around a revealed fact, said quietly that he would call another time and took his leave, pausing only to press Henry's hand briefly and tell her, in an undertone, that the book was on the side table in the hall. Sir Edmund departed shortly after. He addressed no one specific on his way out, which was, Henry thought, the most dignified option available to him under the circumstances, and she did not hold the departure against him with any particular energy. He had held the debt and the contract and had expected them to hold. They had not. That was sufficient. James remained after the others had left. He stood near the window while Lady Cecilia recovered herself sufficiently to excuse herself from the drawing-room, and then the drawing-room had only Henry and Mrs. Potts, who was in the doorway, and him. Mrs. Potts looked at Henry with a very specific expression, and withdrew with the soft efficiency that was her particular gift. Henry sat down on the settee nearest the fire because the effort of standing had become, suddenly, more than she wanted to maintain. He came and sat in the chair across from her, and the fire was low, and the late afternoon light was nearly gone from the grey windows, and they sat in silence for a moment that had, she found, a completely different texture than the silences she had spent in this room over the past 3 years. "The debt," she said. "You retired it without telling me." "Yes." He looked at the fire. "I intended to tell you. I had not yet decided how." She said she was not reproaching him, which was true, and he nodded in a way that suggested he understood the distinction. "You surveyed your own estate's boundary," she said. "The boundary question was genuine. I had been putting it off for 2 years." A pause. The survey was also an excuse. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire with the careful, self-possessed expression she had been reading for 4 weeks, and now read somewhat differently, which was to say she read the restraint in it, rather than only the surface. "An excuse for what?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "To be in this neighbourhood." He looked up from the fire and at her directly. "To determine whether the particular character I had been told was present in the Barrett household was actually present, or whether it was a description of a different thing." He said it simply, without ceremony, in the way he said things he had considered carefully before saying them. She remembered the first morning on the boundary path, the flask of cider vinegar and the 3 biscuits for old Thomas and a man in a worn coat who had been thirsty and had not said so. She had given him water because he was a person who needed water. There had been no calculation in it. "Who told you about the Barrett household?" she asked. "Mrs. Potts was in service at Ashvale when I was a boy," he said. "She left when she married Mr. Potts, who was your father's groom. She has written to my housekeeper on a number of occasions over the past 2 years." Henry looked at the drawing-room door. It was closed. From beyond it, the faint and familiar sounds of the Barrett household going about its evening routine were audible, and one of them, she was quite certain, was the deliberate sound of Mrs. Potts moving away from the vicinity of the door. She looked back at James. I refused the contract before the solicitor on Thursday, she said, because she wanted him to know she had done it before the revelation, before the room had rearranged itself, before any of this had become known to her. I know, he said. Crewe sent a message to Ashvale Thursday evening. He thought I should be aware of the situation. She had refused the contract when it cost something to refuse it, when the cost of refusal was the debt and the house and her mother's standing, and the £3,000 and the only instrument she possessed in her domestic world, and when James Whitmore of the worn coat and the small, precise handwriting had been, to her understanding at the time, a land surveyor who would leave at the end of the week and whose opinion of her decision was not a category of consideration. He knew that. She understood that he knew it. The fire made a small sound, settling. Henry looked at her own hands in her lap and thought about the morning room and the correspondence she had answered and the letters she had sealed and the signature that had appeared on a document without her knowledge or consent. She thought about the 4 weeks of boundary paths and the library and the November air and the rooks in the elm tree and the specific weight of knowing what had been done to her and the specific different weight of continuing to be herself in spite of it. The Barrett household will need to be reconsidered, she said. My mother will require time. Yes, he said. He said it without impatience. She looked up. You are very unhurried for a man who has just caused a considerable amount of disruption to a drawing room. The quality around his eyes changed in a way that she had not seen in 4 weeks, of the boundary path and the library, and which was, she decided, the closest he came to the kind of warmth other people displayed with more breadth. I have been patient for 4 weeks, he said. I can be patient for somewhat longer, Miss Barrett. Henry said nothing, because there was no sentence required. The fire was low and the windows were dark, and the drawing room, which had been the room of her constraint and her mother's management and the grey correspondence of a household maintained on diminishing terms, was very quiet. She was still in it. She had always been in it. Nothing about the room itself had changed. What had changed was what she now understood herself to be in it, and that understanding was not a performance, and not a plan, and not a thing she had arrived at through any instrument she had specifically deployed. It was simply the result of 4 weeks of being exactly who she had always been when no one important was watching. He had been watching. The following morning she rose early, as she always did, and went down to the library before the household was fully awake. The survey document he had left on the library desk was still there, the Barrett boundary confirmed and the drainage ditch named and the 30-year question resolved in small, precise characters. Beside it, she placed the white on Selborne, which she had left bookmarked at the Swallows because she had decided she wanted to finish the passage she had been reading when he came to return the 1748 document and had not managed to finish since. Potts appeared in the library doorway with 2 cups of tea and a dry expression of complete and unrepentant satisfaction. You might have told me, Henry said without looking up. I might have, Mrs. Potts agreed. She set the cups down. But then you would have known, and the knowing would have changed how you carried the flask to the boundary marker the first morning, and the first morning was rather the point. Henry looked at her for a moment. Then she looked back at the page and read about the swallows finishing their passage south, and the cold of the field in the morning after they had gone, and the particular quality of the light that remained once they were no longer in it. The library was warm. The tea was fresh. The document confirming the Barrett boundary lay on the desk in a steady morning light, and through the window the elm tree stood bare against a pale November sky. And somewhere beyond, the half-mile of frost-silvered grass that lay between the Barrett garden and the Ashvale parkland boundary. The 6th Earl of Ashvale was riding out, she thought, toward the southern meadow. She put her hand on the worn cloth cover of the white and turned the page.